Story: The Ghost of a Thousand Cranes. Prologue: The Girl in White. The air in Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park is thick with ghosts. You feel them in the oppressive summer heat that settles over the city like a shroud. You hear them in the drone of the cicadas, a relentless, high-pitched thrum that sounds like a million tiny screams frozen in time. They are in the very soil, a ground once saturated with unspeakable things. But mostly, you see them in the eyes of the people who come here to remember. I was one of them, a tourist from a country that had, in a single flash, sealed this city's fate. I walked manicured paths, my camera hanging uselessly by my side. How do you photograph a void? How do you capture the shape of an absence that spans generations? The skeletal ruin of the A-bomb dome stood as a stark skeletal witness against a placid blue sky, its mangled iron frame a permanent scream etched into the skyline. It was near the Children's Peace Monument that I saw her. The monument itself is a testament to a hope born from unimaginable pain. A dome structure, and atop it, a bronze statue of a girl holding a massive wireframe crane aloft, reaching for the sky. Glass cases surrounding the base were filled with a kaleidoscope of color, millions of tiny paper cranes, folded by children from every corner of the world, strung together in vibrant, cascading chains. They were prayers made tangible, tiny paper wings carrying a heavy, silent wish for peace. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the Ota River in hues of orange and blood. The crowds were thinning. It was in that quiet, liminal space between day and night that she appeared. She stood a little ways off, near a weeping willow whose branches drooped like grieving arms. She was a girl, perhaps 11 or 12, dressed in a simple, almost luminous white dress. It was a stark, ghostly white against the deepening twilight. Her hair was jet black, cut in a neat bob that framed a pale, delicate face. She wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was fixed on the monument, on the bronze girl with the crane. There was an intensity in her posture, a stillness that was utterly out of place. Children fidget, they run, they laugh. This girl was as still as a photograph, a frozen moment of sorrow. A cool breeze, unseasonal for the humid evening, rustled the willow leaves and the hem of her white dress, but she did not seem to feel it. I raised my camera instinctively, then lowered it. There was something profane about trying to capture her. It felt like a violation. I watched her for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute. She took a single, hesitant step towards the monument, her bare feet silent on the stone path. Then, as if sensing my gaze, she turned her head. Her eyes met mine. They were ancient eyes in a child's face, dark pools of knowledge and a sadness so profound it felt like a physical blow. There was no accusation in them, no anger, only a deep, unending wariness. She held my gaze for a heartbeat, and in that moment the drone of the cicadas seemed to fall silent. The world held its breath. Then she was gone. She didn't run or walk away, she simply faded, like smoke dissipating in the wind, or a memory you can't quite hold on to. The space where she stood was empty. The cicadas resumed their shrill chorus, and the spell was broken. I stood there, my own heart hammering against my ribs, a cold sweat beading on my brow. I asked a park attendant, an elderly man sweeping leaves nearby, if he had seen a little girl in a white dress. He paused his work, his hands gnarled and weathered. He looked at the spot where she had been, then at the children's monument, and then back at me. A knowing, melancholic look passed over his features. "Ah," he said, his voice a soft, raspy whisper. "You have seen her then, you have seen Sadako." He wouldn't say more, he just bowed his head slightly and returned to his sweeping, leaving me alone with the ghosts and a name that would come to haunt me. Sadako. I had to know her story, not the simple, sanitized version printed in tourist brochures, but the real story, the story of the flash, the sickness, the paper, and the ghost of 1,000 cranes. Part 1. The Sun and the Shadow. Before the ghost, there was a girl full of life, of kinetic energy that seemed barely contained by her small frame. Her name was Sadako Sasaki, and in the summer of 1945, she was 2 years old. A toddler with bright eyes and legs that were just learning the joy of running. Her world was the scent of her mother's cooking, the sharp, clean smell of the chemicals in her father's barbershop, and the familiar labyrinth of streets, in the Misasa Bridge neighborhood of Hiroshima. Life was a simple, comforting rhythm. The clatter of wooden gaita on the pavement, the call of the tofu vendor in the morning, the warm weight of her mother's hand. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the sun rose with a particularly fierce intensity. It was a sweltering, clear day. Sadako was at home with her mother, Fuji, and her grandmother. Her father, Shigeo, had already gone to his barbershop. The air was still, heavy with the promise of more heat. The city hummed with the routine of wartime life, a life of rationing, of air raid drills, but a life nonetheless. At 8:15 a.m., the world was torn apart. It came without warning. Not the familiar wail of a siren, but something far more primal, more alien. First, there was the Pika, the flash. An impossible light, a second sun, brighter and more terrible than anything humanity had ever conceived, detonated in the sky. It was not a color, but the absence of it. A white so absolute, it bleached the world of all dimension. It was the light of creation and annihilation, compressed into a single, silent microsecond. Sadako's mother, acting on pure animal instinct, grabbed her small daughter and hurled her under a table, just as the dawn, the boom, arrived. It was not a sound one hears with the ears. It was a physical force, a concussion that shattered the very air. The house didn't just shake, it exploded. Wood splintered. Roof tiles turned to shrapnel, and the walls imploded. The world became a maelstrom of noise, darkness, and flying debris. Sadako, small and terrified, was blown out of the house into the yard, a tiny leaf in a hurricane. Her mother, dazed and bleeding, scrambled through the wreckage, screaming her daughter's name. Panic, sharp and metallic, clawed at her throat. She found Sadako sitting in the debris, miraculously unharmed, a bewildered look on her face. But their moment of relief was fleeting. The world outside their shattered home was a vision from hell. The sky, which moments before had been a brilliant blue, was now a bruised, roiling purple-black. A monstrous, mushroom-shaped cloud climbed towards the heavens, a grotesque monument to the city's death. Fires began to bloom everywhere, born from the blast's thermal pulse, spreading with terrifying speed through the wooden houses, merging into a single, city-wide firestorm. And then came the black rain. It wasn't water. It was thick, greasy, and black, composed of dirt, dust, ash, and the radioactive fission products from the bomb's core. It fell in heavy, sticky drops, coating everything and everyone it touched. Sadako, still sitting in the yard, looked up at the sky, her mouth open in a silent cry, and the poison rain fell on her. Her mother snatched her up, shielding her with her own body, and they began to run. They ran with a stream of other survivors, a procession of the damned. These were not people anymore, but specters. Their clothes were burned from their bodies, their skin, scorched by the heat rays, hung from them in tatters, like peeling rags. They walked with their arms held out in front of them, a ghost parade of the walking dead, moaning for water, for help, for an end to the pain. The air was filled with the smell of burning flesh and the cries of the injured. Fuji and Sadako, along with her grandmother, found themselves pushed towards the river. They waded in, seeking refuge from the inferno. The river was choked with bodies. They saw their neighbor, his face a blackened, unrecognizable mask. They stumbled through the chaos, driven by the singular, primal need to survive. Her mother, dazed and bleeding, scrambled through the wreckage, screaming her daughter's name. Panic, sharp and metallic, clawed at her throat. She found Sadako sitting in the debris, miraculously unharmed, a bewildered look on her face. But their moment of relief was fleeting. The world outside their shattered home was a vision from hell. The sky, which moments before had been a brilliant blue, was now a bruised, roiling purple-black. A monstrous, mushroom-shaped cloud climbed towards the heavens, a grotesque monument to the city's death. Fires began to bloom everywhere, born from the blast's thermal pulse, spreading with terrifying speed through the wooden houses, merging into a single citywide firestorm. And then came the black rain. It wasn't water. It was thick, greasy, and black, composed of dirt, dust, ash, and the radioactive fission products from the bomb's core. It fell in heavy, sticky drops, coating everything and everyone it touched. Sadako, still sitting in the yard, looked up at the sky, her mouth open in a silent cry, and the poison rain fell on her. Her mother snatched her up, shielding her with her own body, and they began to run. They ran with a stream of other survivors, a procession of the damned. These were not people anymore, but specters. Their clothes were burned from their bodies, their skin, scorched by the heat rays, hung from them in tatters, like peeling rags. They walked with their arms held out in front of them, a ghost parade of the walking dead, moaning for water, for help, for an end to the pain. The air was filled with the smell of burning flesh and the cries of the injured. Fuji and Sadako, along with her grandmother, found themselves pushed towards the river. They waded in, seeking refuge from the inferno. The river was choked with bodies. They saw their neighbor, his face a blackened, unrecognizable mask. They stumbled through the chaos, driven by the singular, primal need to survive. Somehow, in the pandemonium, they survived. They found Sadako's father, Shidio, who had also miraculously escaped the worst of the blast. But Sadako's grandmother, weakened and burned, went back into the inferno to retrieve some family heirlooms from their burning home. She was never seen again. One ghost among hundreds of thousands. In the days that followed, the true horror began to reveal itself. It wasn't just the burns and the blast injuries. A new insidious sickness began to take hold. People who had seemed fine, who had survived the initial blast, began to develop purple spots on their skin. Their hair fell out in clumps. They bled from their gums, their noses, their bowels. They died in agony, their bodies turning against them. It was a silent, invisible killer, the bomb's second, more patient wave of death, radiation sickness, the A-bomb disease. But little Sadako seemed fine. She was a symbol of hope for the Sasaki family. They had lost their home, their grandmother, their entire world, but they had their children. And as Hiroshima slowly, painfully began to rise from the ashes, so too did Sadako grow. The shadow of the Pikadon was long, but she was a child of the sun. She ran, she played, she grew strong. The family tried to forget. They tried to build a new life on the haunted ground. For a time, it seemed they had succeeded. The bomb was a memory, a nightmare from which they had, by some miracle, awoken. They were wrong. The bomb never lets you go. It plants a seed, and it waits. Part 2. The Creeping Dread. 9 years passed. Hiroshima was a city reborn, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. New buildings rose where there had been only rubble. Trams once again rattled along the streets. Life, in all its mundane, beautiful glory, had returned. And Sadako was the embodiment of that new life. By 1954, at the age of 11, she was a star. She was tall for her age, strong, and possessed a boundless infectious energy. Her passion was running. On the school track, she was a blur of motion, her powerful legs pumping, her black hair flying behind her as she anchored her class's relay team. For her, running was freedom. It was the ultimate expression of her health, of her victory over the past. When she ran, she was not a survivor of the atomic bomb. She was just Sadako, the fastest girl in her school. Her dream was to become a physical education teacher. She and her best friend Chizuka Hamamoto spent hours talking about the future, a future that seemed as bright and limitless as the sky over their rebuilt city. The bomb was a story their parents told, a historical event they learned about in school. It felt distant, disconnected from her vibrant, healthy body. The first whisper of the shadow came in the fall of that year. During a practice run, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The world tilted, the track seemed to rise up to meet her, and she stumbled, falling to her knees. Her teammates crowded around, concerned. She brushed it off. "I'm just tired," she said, forcing a smile. But it was the first crack in the perfect facade of her health. The episodes became more frequent. A sudden weariness would descend upon her, a leaden fatigue that settled deep in her bones. She started getting colds that she couldn't shake. Then her parents noticed the swelling, lumps on her neck, behind her ears, under her arms. They were small at first, but they were there. Fuji and Shigeo Sasaki watched their daughter with a growing, unspoken terror. Every parent in Hiroshima lived with this fear, a cold knot of dread that tightened in their stomachs whenever a child complained of a headache or developed an unusual bruise. They knew the bomb's poison was patient. They had seen what it did to their friends, their neighbors. They prayed it would not come for their daughter. In January 1955, Sadako collapsed at school. This time, there was no brushing it off. Her parents took her to the Red Cross hospital. The antiseptic smell of the corridors, the hushed, serious tones of the doctors, the sterile white of the rooms. It was a world away from the sun-drenched track where she belonged. The tests began. Blood was drawn. X-rays were taken. The doctors' faces grew graver with each result. They conferred in low voices, their words a clinical, terrifying litany. White blood cell count, bone marrow, blast cells. Finally, the doctor called Shigeo and Fuji into his office. The room was small, the air thick with unspoken truths. He didn't waste words. "It's leukemia," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Subacute leukemia of the lymph glands." The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Leukemia. It was the name they had all come to dread. It was the A-bomb disease. A death sentence. The doctor gave her a year, maybe less. Shigeo felt the floor drop out from under him. The past, which he had tried so hard to bury, had just risen from its grave and claimed his daughter. Fuji let out a sound. Not a cry, but a thin, wounded whimper. The sound of a mother's heart breaking. The true horror of the bomb wasn't the single blinding flash. It was this slow, creeping, insidious decay. It was a monster that had hidden inside his child's body for a decade, waiting for the right moment to emerge and devour her from the inside out. It was a ghost that could not be exorcised. They had to tell her. How do you tell a vibrant, life-loving 11-year-old girl that she is dying? They tried to soften the blow. They told her she had a serious illness and would need to stay in the hospital for a while. Sadako, lying in the stark white hospital bed, looked at their devastated faces and knew. Children have a sixth sense for the truth, especially when it is terrible. She didn't cry. A profound, unnerving stillness came over her. The energetic, vibrant girls seemed to recede, replaced by someone older, someone who had just looked into the abyss. Her world shrank to the four walls of her hospital room. The view from her window was of a city moving on without her. She could see children playing, people walking, cars driving, a life she was no longer a part of. The disease was a thief, and its horror was in its methodical slowness. It didn't kill you all at once. It took things from you, one by one. First your strength, then your hair, then your hope. The hospital was filled with children like her, children of the atom. They were all pale shadows of their former selves, tethered to IV drips, their laughter replaced by quiet coughs. They were a generation of ghosts in waiting. Sadako was terrified. At night, in the dark, the fear was a physical presence in the room. It was a cold weight on her chest, a whispering voice that told her there was no escape. The bomb that had missed her 10 years ago had found her after all. It had just taken a longer, more cruel path. Part 3. 1,000 Wings of Hope. In August 1955, a gift arrived. From the city of Nagoya, a high school club sent a collection of colorful paper cranes to the patients at the Red Cross hospital, a gesture of goodwill and hope. It was Chizuko, Sadako's best friend, who brought one of the golden paper cranes to her bedside. "Do you know the old story, Sadako-chan?" Chizuko asked, her voice bright with forced optimism. "They say that if a person folds 1,000 paper cranes, the gods will grant them a wish." She unfolded the golden crane carefully, showing Sadako the intricate creases, then folded it back into its bird-like shape. "You have to fold 1,000, she repeated, placing it in Sadako's hand. "And then, you will get well again." A flicker of something, not quite belief, but a desperate willingness to try, ignited in Sadako's weary eyes. A task, a goal, something to fight the encroaching darkness. 1,000 cranes. It was a number so large it felt impossible, but it was also tangible. It was something she could do. 1,000, Sadako whispered, her fingers tracing the sharp edges of the golden paper. I will do it. And so began the race against time. The battle was no longer fought on the running track, but in the sterile confines of her hospital bed. Her weapon was not speed, but patience. Her opponent was not another runner, but the decay in her own blood. Paper was a precious commodity. She used everything she could get her hands on. Medicine wrappers, which were waxy and difficult to fold, became small, mottled cranes. Old newspapers, gift wrapping from visitors, any scrap she could find was transformed. Her father would travel for hours to find her colorful squares of paper. Her hands, once strong and capable, were now slow and deliberate. The simple act of making a sharp crease took immense effort. Her room began to change. The first few cranes dangled from a string above her bed, lonely sentinels of hope. But as the days passed, their numbers grew. 10 became 50, 50 became 100. They hung in colorful garlands, a vibrant, fragile flock taking flight in the sterile white room. They were every color of the rainbow, fiery reds, serene blues, sunny yellows, a paper rebellion against the monochrome world of sickness. Folding the cranes became her ritual, her meditation, her prayer. With each fold, she whispered her wish, I want to live. Her family and her classmates rallied around her. They brought her paper. They sat with her for hours, their own fingers fumbling to learn the ancient art of origami. The room would be filled with the soft rustle of paper and the quiet determination of love. But the disease was relentless. The horror was now a daily reality. The pain in her bones became a constant gnawing ache. Her hair, once her pride, began to fall out. She would find black strands on her white pillowcase in the morning, stark reminders of her body's betrayal. Her gums bled. The purple spots, the dreaded signature of the illness, appeared on her legs. There were good days and bad days. On good days, she was almost the old Sadako. She would sit up in bed, her face bright, and she would fold cranes with a feverish intensity, her fingers flying. She would talk with her family, laugh at her brother Masahiro's jokes, and plan her return to school. On those days, the 1,000 cranes seemed within reach. The wish felt real. On bad days, the pain was all-consuming. She was too weak to even lift her hands. The paper sat untouched on her bedside table. On those days, the cranes hanging above her seemed to mock her, their bright colors a cruel contrast to her own fading vitality. The fear would return, the cold whisper in the dark. She would look at the growing flock and wonder if she was just folding her own memorial. She passed the 500 mark, the 600 mark. Her flock was magnificent, a testament to her will. But her body was failing. The doctors, their faces etched with pity, could offer nothing but pain management. Her white blood cell count was astronomical. Her body was at war with itself, and it was losing. One day, her mother was helping her with a particularly difficult fold. Sadako's hands were swollen and clumsy. Fuji looked at her daughter's pale, determined face, at the colorful paper world she had built around her, and her heart shattered anew. You don't have to do this, Sadako, she said, her voice thick with tears. You can rest. Sadako looked up, her dark eyes burning with a fierce light. I have to, she said, her voice a reedy whisper. I have to finish. Her wish began to change. In the beginning, she folded for herself. She folded to run again. But as her illness progressed, as she saw the suffering of the other children in the ward, her prayer expanded. She folded for them too. She folded for a world where no other child would ever have to see a second sun in the sky. Each crease in the paper became a plea for peace. The horror wasn't just the physical decay. It was the psychological torment. It was the hope, that cruelest of emotions, that would surge on good days only to be crushed on the bad. The 1,000 cranes were a lifeline, but they were also a countdown. Every crane she finished was one closer to the goal, but also one day closer to the end the doctors had predicted. The race was on, and Sadako was running with everything she had left. Part 4, the last crane. By early October, the autumn chill had begun to seep into the city. The leaves on the trees outside Sadako's window were turning gold and red, a final brilliant burst of life before the coming winter. Inside room 316 of the Red Cross Hospital, Sadako was fading. The flock of cranes now numbered over 900. They filled the room, a breathtaking, silent aviary. They hung from the ceiling, were strung along the walls, and clustered on her windowsill. They had become a local legend. Nurses and doctors would stop by just to look at them, to witness the fierce hope contained in the small paper birds. But the girl who had made them was a ghost of her former self. The pain was constant now, a deep, merciless fire in her bones that morphine could only dull, not extinguish. Her legs, once so strong they had carried her to victory, were swollen and purple, useless. Most days, she was too weak to eat, too tired to speak. The vibrant girl who loved to run was gone, replaced by a frail, ethereal creature lost in a too large hospital gown. A simple, white gown. Yet, she clung to life with a tenacity that stunned everyone around her. And she clung to the cranes. Her family would find her awake, late at night, in the faint glow of a nightlight, her thin fingers fumbling with a small square of paper. The effort was monumental. Folding a single crane could take her an hour, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Each fold was an act of defiance. She folded her 1,000th crane. Her family celebrated, their cheers hollow in the quiet room. 1,000 cranes. The wish was supposed to come now, but Sadako did not get better. She looked at the 1,000 birds, her wish fulfilled, and then she looked at her own failing body. There was no magic. A profound, heartbreaking realization settled over her. Perhaps the wish wasn't for her. Perhaps it was never about her. She did not stop. She began to fold more. 1,001. 1,002. She would fold a crane, and then her eyes would close from exhaustion. Her father would gently take it from her limp hand and hang it with the others. Why did she continue? No one knew for sure. Maybe it was the only thing she had left. Maybe, in her heart, she was no longer folding for life, but for memory. She was folding herself into eternity. On the morning of October 25, 1955, the end came. Her family was gathered around her bed. The room was quiet, save for the whisper of the wind against the window pane, making the hundreds of paper cranes stir gently on their strings. They danced in the faint light, a silent, colorful farewell. Sadako's breathing was shallow. She was barely conscious. Her mother, Fuji, held her hand. It was cold. Shigeo stood at the foot of the bed, his face a mask of stoic grief, watching the last flicker of his daughter's life. Sadako's eyes opened one last time. They were unfocused, looking past her family, past the walls of the room. She whispered something. A single word. So faint, they almost missed it. Ochazuke, she murmured. Tea on rice, her favorite comfort food. A final, simple taste of life. Her mother nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, my love, I'll make it for you. But Sadako was already gone. A final, gentle exhale, and the spirit that had fought so hard, for so long, was finally free. She was 12 years old. The official count of the cranes she folded herself is disputed. Some say she completed the 1,000. Others say she only made it to 644 before she became too weak, and that her classmates folded the rest in her honor. But in the end, the number didn't matter. Her death sent a shockwave through her school. The vibrant, determined girl who had been their friend, their teammate, their inspiration, was gone. But her story, and the story of the cranes, had taken root. They refused to let her be forgotten. Led by her friends, the students of her school began a campaign. They wrote letters, collected funds, and shared Sadako's story with the world. They wanted to build a monument not just for Sadako, but for all the children who had been killed by the bomb, the ones who died in the fire, and the ones who died years later from the invisible poison. 3 years later, on Children's Day in 1958, their dream became a reality. The Children's Peace Monument was unveiled in the heart of Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, and at its base, an inscription was carved into the black marble, a message born from a dying child's final wish. This is our cry, this is our prayer, for building peace in the world. Her classmates placed the last of her cranes, the ones they had folded to complete her flock, within the monument. They were home. Epilogue. The Story in the White Dress. I stood in the deepening twilight of the Peace Park, the old attendant's words echoing in my mind. You have seen Sadako. The story he wouldn't tell me, I now knew. I had pieced it together from books, from archives, from the quiet sorrow that still permeates this city. The ghost I had seen was not a specter of horror, but a specter of memory. I looked again at the monument. The bronze girl on top, reaching for the sky with her crane, was Sadako, and the girl in the white dress I had seen. I understood now. It wasn't a dress. It was a hospital gown. The simple, sterile white of her last days. Or perhaps it was the white of a burial kimono, the white of innocence lost. She wasn't haunting the park. She was bearing witness. Her spirit, forever 12 years old, is woven into this place. She is in the rustle of the paper wings as a breeze passes through the glass cases. She is in the solemn toll of the peace bell. She is in the faces of the school children who come here on field trips, their hands full of their own brightly colored cranes. The horror of Sadako's story is not that of a simple ghost tale. It is the real, grinding horror of what we are capable of doing to one another. The bomb was a monster of our own making, and its ghosts are not chained ghouls in a haunted house. They are the silent, lingering shadows in our collective conscience. They are the children who never got to grow up, the futures that were vaporized in an instant, and the slow, agonizing deaths that followed for years after. Sadako Sasaki did not get her wish to live, but her other, larger wish, the one she folded into her cranes in her final days, endures. It is a wish for peace, a wish carried on the wings of millions of paper birds that arrive here every year, a global chorus joining her own. As I finally turned to leave the park, I glanced back one last time at the spot near the willow tree. It was empty, of course, but for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of white, a whisper on the wind. It wasn't frightening, it was a reminder, a promise. Her story is not over. It is told and retold, a modern folktale with a terrible, true core. As long as there are wars, as long as there are children who suffer in them, the girl in the white dress will stand her silent vigil in Hiroshima, her ancient eyes asking the one question we have yet to answer. Her cry, her prayer, still hangs in the air, waiting for a world that is ready to listen. Story: The Chaconne of the Ruin. The old man, my guide, had a face like a dried riverbed, etched with the lines of stories I could never truly comprehend. He stood with me under the punishing August sun, his gaze fixed not on me, but on the skeletal ghost of a building across the river. The Genbaku Dome, the atomic bomb dome. Its ravaged ribs of steel and stone clawed at a sky that was, on this day, an unforgiving, indifferent blue. Most people see a symbol of peace, he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that the breeze threatened to steal. They see a reminder, a warning. But some of us who have lived long enough, we hear something else. He turned to me, his eyes dark and deep as wells. They say that on the quietest nights, when the city finally holds its breath, you can still hear her. You can hear her violin. And so he told me the story, not the sanitized version from the pamphlets, but the one whispered in hushed tones, the one that carries the chill of the grave. It is a story of art and ambition, of a terrible beauty and a horror that music could not silence, but perhaps could outlive. This is the story of Akiko Tanaka and the melody that became the soul of the ruin. Part 1. The Palace of Sound. In the spring of 1945, Hiroshima was a city holding its breath. The war was a distant thunder, a constant low-grade fever that manifested in rationed sugar, nightly blackout drills, and the nervous glances cast towards the sky. But for 17-year-old Akiko Tanaka, the war was merely an inconvenient hum beneath the glorious, soaring architecture of her own world. And the cathedral of that world, was the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall. To the citizens of Hiroshima, it was a landmark, a proud European-style building with a magnificent copper-green dome that shimmered in the sun. It was a symbol of their city's modernity, a place of commerce and exhibitions. To Akiko, it was simply the palace. It was the only place in the city with acoustics that felt alive, that could take the sound from her violin and make it bloom, filling the cavernous spaces until the very air vibrated with a life of its own. Her violin was an extension of her soul. It wasn't a fancy German antique, but a lovingly crafted instrument from her father, a carpenter who had saved for years to acquire the perfect cuts of maple and spruce. He told her it was made from the wood of a tree that had been struck by lightning but refused to burn, and she believed him. The violin had a voice that was both fiery and mournful, and in Akiko's hands it wept and sang and raged. Akiko was a prodigy. That wasn't vanity, it was a simple, observable fact, like the turning of the seasons. Her fingers, long and nimble, moved over the fingerboard with a preternatural grace. Her bowing arm was a marvel of controlled power. But talent, she knew, was a raw material. It had to be forged. And the piece she had chosen as her forge was the cruelest, most beautiful masterwork she had ever known. Johann Sebastian Bach's Chaconne from the Partita in D minor. The Chaconne was a monster, a 15-minute solo epic of such technical and emotional complexity that it was considered a summit for the world's greatest violinists. It was a cathedral of sound, built from a single instrument, a journey through every shade of human feeling, grief, fury, despair, and a final, fragile glimmer of hope. For Akiko, mastering it was not an ambition, it was a holy quest. Every day she could, she would slip away to the palace. She'd found a champion in Mr. Ito, the building's elderly, stoop-shouldered caretaker. He had seen the fire in her eyes, heard the God-given talent in her playing, and had secretly granted her access to the main exhibition hall after hours. "The building likes music, little bird," he told her once, his voice raspy from a lifetime of cheap cigarettes. "It gets lonely. All these empty rooms, all this glass and stone, it gets hungry for a voice. Your violin feeds it." At first, Akiko had laughed. But as the weeks bled into months, she began to understand what he meant. The palace did feel alive. When she played, the great hall seemed to breathe with her. The high, vaulted ceilings would catch the notes and hold them for a moment longer than they should, letting them mingle and fade in a ghostly, resonant sigh. The light slanting through the tall, arched windows seemed to bend and soften in time with the music. But there was another side to it. A creeping, subtle strangeness that began to unnerve her. Sometimes, in the brief silences between the Chaconne's demanding variations, she would hear echoes, not of her own music, but of something else. A faint whisper, like 1,000 people murmuring just beyond the edge of hearing. She would stop, her bow hovering over the strings, her heart suddenly pounding. The sound would vanish, leaving only the oppressive silence of the empty hall. She told Mr. Ito about it. He just nodded slowly, his eyes clouded with a strange, old-world superstition. "The walls remember, little bird," he said, tapping a stone column with his bony knuckles. "Everything that happens, every word spoken, every song sung, it leaves a mark. A stain on the air. This building has seen much. It remembers." One evening in late July, the feeling was stronger than ever. The air was thick and humid, a typical Hiroshima summer. Outside, the city was battening down the hatches. American B-29s, the Bison as they were fearfully called, were dropping leaflets, promising destruction. The air raid sirens had become a nightly chorus. Fear was a metallic taste in the back of everyone's throat. Inside the palace, Akiko sought refuge in her music. She was wrestling with the Chaconne's brutal arpeggio section, a cascade of notes that demanded inhuman precision. Her fingers ached. Her shoulder was a knot of fire. She paused, catching her breath, sweat stinging her eyes, and then she heard it. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a sound, clear and distinct, from the far end of the darkened hall. The sound of a single, sharp intake of breath, as if someone was standing there in the shadows, listening. "Mr. Ito?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. Silence. Who's there? The only answer was the faint, mocking echo of her own voice. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The hall, her sanctuary, suddenly felt vast and menacing. The long shadows cast by the columns looked like grasping fingers. The high dome above was a dark, hollow eye staring down at her. For the first time, Akiko was afraid of the palace. She packed her violin with fumbling, clumsy hands, the comforting scent of its cedar and rosin doing little to calm her nerves. She didn't look back as she fled into the twilight, the heavy doors booming shut behind her like the lid of a sarcophagus. That night, she had a nightmare. She dreamt she was standing alone in the center of the exhibition hall, playing the chaconne. But the violin made no sound. Her fingers moved, her bow danced, but there was only silence. A dead, suffocating silence. And from the walls, from the floor, from the great dome itself, she could feel a terrible mounting pressure, a silent scream of sound being held back, waiting to be released. She awoke in a cold sweat, the phantom silence still ringing in her ears. Part 2. The Unraveling. The first week of August 1945 was a pressure cooker. The heat was relentless, the air so thick with moisture it felt like you were breathing water. The fear in the city was just as palpable. The leaflets kept falling from the sky like poisonous snow. They spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. Most people dismissed it as propaganda, another American scare tactic. How could one bomb be any more cruel than the firebombings that had already incinerated Tokyo? Akiko's mother, a woman whose anxiety was a constant, fluttering presence, begged her to stop going to the palace. "It's not safe, Akiko-chan. The Americans are targeting major buildings. Stay home. Practice here." "I can't, Kasan," Akiko would plead, her frustration boiling over. "You don't understand. The sound is dead here. The chaconne needs space. It needs to breathe. I'm so close. I can almost feel it." Her obsession with the piece had become a fever. It was no longer just about mastering it. It was about conquering it, about taming the beast before it consumed her. The whispers and strange feelings in the palace had become part of the challenge. She told herself it was just the stress of the war, her imagination playing tricks on her. She would fight the fear with music. On the morning of August 5th, she had a breakthrough. She played the entire chaconne from start to finish without a single major error. The music flowed from her not as a series of notes, but as a single continuous river of emotion. In the final sublime D major chords, a sense of transcendent peace washed over her. The sound rang through the hall, pure and perfect, and for a moment the whispers were gone. The building seemed to sigh in contentment. Akiko stood panting in the center of the hall, tears of exhaustion and triumph streaming down her face. Mr. Ito was there, leaning on his broom in the doorway. He didn't applaud. He just watched her with his sad, knowing eyes. "You've done it, little bird," he said softly. "You have fed the ghost. Now let it rest." "One more time," Akiko declared, her voice ringing with a newfound confidence. "Tomorrow morning. I will come back tomorrow morning and play it one last perfect time. For myself." Mr. Ito's face clouded over. "Tomorrow is not a good day to be here." "What do you mean?" He looked up at the great dome, then back at her. "The air feels wrong. It's too quiet. It's the kind of quiet that comes before the world tears itself apart." He shuffled closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The building. It's waiting for something. It's holding its breath. Don't be here when it exhales." His words sent a shiver down her spine. But her ambition was a roaring fire that consumed all fear. "It's just the heat, old man," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "I'll be fine. I'll be here at 8. That night, her argument with her mother was the worst it had ever been. "You are forbidden," her mother shrieked, her voice thin with panic. "I have a terrible feeling, Akiko, a premonition. Stay with us." "You're trying to smother me," Akiko yelled back, the cruel words of a teenager who cannot see past the boundaries of her own world. "This is the most important thing in my life, and you don't care." She stormed off to her room, slamming the shoji screen behind her. She did not see the tears welling in her mother's eyes, or the look of weary resignation on her father's face. Her last memory of them would be one of anger and misunderstanding. The morning of August 6th dawned clear and beautiful, a perfect summer day. The sky was a high, cloudless dome of blue. The city was stirring, the familiar sounds of trams and bicycle bells filling the air. After a restless night, Akiko felt a strange sense of calm. Today was the day. Today, she would achieve perfection. She slipped out of the house before her parents were fully awake, her violin case clutched in her hand like a holy relic. She left a short, conciliatory note on the kitchen table, promising to be home for lunch. As she walked through the waking city, she felt Mr. Ito's words echo in her mind. "The air feels wrong. It's too quiet." He was right. Despite the morning bustle, there was an unnatural stillness, a tension in the atmosphere that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She shook it off. It was just nerves. When she arrived at the palace, the great doors were already unlocked. Mr. Ito was nowhere to be seen. The main exhibition hall was bathed in the soft golden light of the early morning sun. It looked serene, peaceful, her sanctuary. She walked to the very center of the room, directly under the apex of the dome. She unlatched her violin case, the familiar scent of wood and rosin, a comforting balm. She lifted the instrument to her shoulder, took a deep, steadying breath, and drew her bow across the strings, sounding a perfect, resonant A. The note hung in the air, impossibly long, impossibly pure. The building seemed to drink it in. The whispers were gone. The fear was gone. There was only Akiko, her violin, and the music. She began to play. The opening chords of the chaconne, stately and somber, filled the hall. She played with a grace and power she had never possessed before. This was it. This was the performance she had been striving for. The music was not just in her fingers and her arms. It was in her blood, in her bones. She was no longer Akiko Tanaka playing Bach. She was the chaconne. She closed her eyes, lost in the intricate dance of melody and harmony. She moved through the dark, tormented variations, the furious, lightning-fast arpeggios, the passages of heart-wrenching beauty. She was oblivious to the world outside, oblivious to the lone American B-29, the Enola Gay, as it flew high and unseen in the serene blue sky above. She was oblivious to the passing of time. She reached the glorious finale, the triumphant return to D major. The music swelled, a testament to hope, to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of suffering. Her bow danced across the strings, pulling the last magnificent chord from the heart of the violin. The chord was a sunburst of sound, a final, perfect declaration. It rose up, up, up into the great copper dome, and hung there, shimmering for one eternal, crystalline moment. And in that moment, at 8:15 a.m., the world outside her palace of sound was incinerated by a light brighter than 1,000 suns. Part 3. The silence and the sound. There was no sound. That was the first horror. For a girl whose entire existence was defined by sound, its absolute and instantaneous absence was a violation, a tearing of the very fabric of reality. One moment, the final perfect chord of the chaconne was resonating in the soul of the building. The next, there was nothing. A void. A silence so profound, so complete, it was a physical pressure against her eardrums. Then came the light. It wasn't a light you see with your eyes. It was a light you feel in your bones. Through her closed eyelids, the world turned a terrifying, incandescent white. It was the color of a god's rage, a pure, silent, all-consuming whiteness that bleached the world of all shadow, all color, all form. For a fraction of a second that stretched into an agonizing eternity, she was suspended in this silent, white universe, she and the final, fading ghost of her music. Then the heat hit her. It wasn't like the heat of the sun or a fire. It was a wave of pure thermal energy that instantly vaporized the moisture on her skin. She felt a searing, unimaginable pain as the pattern of her kimono was burned directly onto her back. The exquisite varnish on her father's violin bubbled and blackened in a split second. And then, finally, came the sound. It was not a sound, it was the end of sound. It was the atmosphere itself being torn apart, a supersonic shockwave, a physical wall of compressed air, slammed into the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall. The magnificent, tall windows didn't just shatter, they atomized, turning into a billion glittering needles of supersonic glass. The stone walls groaned, the pillars cracked. The mighty copper dome, the building's crown, was lifted up, peeled back, and ripped apart as if by an invisible giant hand. The structure screamed a death agony of twisting steel and crumbling mortar. Akiko Tanaka, standing directly beneath the dome's apex, was at the epicenter of this structural cataclysm. The last thing she ever knew was the world collapsing upon her, a final, crushing crescendo of stone and steel. Her body, her violin, her music, all were consumed by the ruin. She and the palace became one. The silence that followed was the silence of the abyss, a silence punctuated by the roar of the firestorm that now consumed the city, the whisper of the black, radioactive rain that began to fall, and the faint, tormented cries of the dying. Weeks later, a young man named Kenji stumbled through the skeletal remains of what was once his city. Kenji had been a school friend of Akiko's. He had secretly admired her from afar, enchanted by her fierce dedication and the otherworldly music she could create. He had survived the bomb because he had been working in a factory on the outskirts of the city, shielded by the hills. His family had not been so lucky. Now, he was one of the Hibakusha, the explosion-affected people, a walking ghost in a city of ghosts. He wandered the ruins in a daze of grief and shock, the blasted landscape a perfect mirror of the devastation in his own soul. The days were a blur of searching for familiar faces in the endless, shuffling lines of the injured, of breathing in the sweet, sickening smell of death that hung over everything. The nights were worse. The silence of the dead city was a crushing weight. One moonless night, driven by a morbid, inexplicable pull, he found himself by the Motoyasu River, staring at the ghastly skeleton of the Industrial Promotion Hall. It was one of the few structures still recognizable near the hypocenter, a jagged, broken crown against a starless sky, a tombstone for a city. He sat on a pile of rubble, the black river flowing silently past, and wept. He wept for his parents, for his little sister, for his friends. He wept for Akiko, who he had heard was practicing in the hall that morning. And as he sat there, enveloped by his grief and the profound silence of the ruin, he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind whistling through the bent steel girders of the dome, but it wasn't. This was a sound with shape, with purpose. It was faint, fragile, like a memory you can't quite grasp. It was music. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was the sound of a solo violin. It was thin, ethereal, and woven with an impossible sadness. He strained to listen, telling himself he was going mad, that the horror had finally broken his mind. But the melody grew, just slightly in clarity. It was a complex, haunting tune, full of sorrow and fury, and a strange, defiant beauty. A tune he recognized. He had heard Akiko practicing it for months, its difficult passages echoing from the windows of the school music room. It was the chaconne. Kenji scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and awe. The music was coming from the ruin, from the hollow, skeletal dome. It was impossible. There was nothing there but death and debris. The ghostly melody swirled and eddied in the darkness, each note a tear, each phrase a cry of anguish. It was not a perfect performance. It was flawed, broken, filled with the ghostly static of unspeakable trauma. It was the sound of a soul trapped between worlds, forced to endlessly replay the last beautiful moment of its life, right before the annihilation. He listened, mesmerized, until the final spectral chord faded into the oppressive silence of the night. Kenji was the first, but he would not be the last. In the weeks and months that followed, others heard it. Survivors huddling for warmth near the riverbank, grieving parents searching for a sign of their lost children. They would hear the faint, heartbreaking sound of a violin coming from the ruin on the quietest nights. The story began to spread in hushed whispers. The story of the ghost of the young violinist, forever bound to the building where she met her end. They said her spirit had been fused with the structure, her music stained into its very stones by the atomic fire. They said she was still trying to finish her song, to find that one moment of perfection before the white light came again. Epilogue. The enduring melody. They decided to preserve it, my guide said, his voice pulling me from the depths of the story and back to the sun-drenched present. He gestured with a wrinkled hand towards the Genbaku Dome. There was much debate. Many wanted to tear it down, to erase the painful memory. But in the end, they chose to let it stand. A witness. We stood there in silence for a long time, watching the tourists take photos, their faces a mixture of solemnity and detached curiosity. They saw a historical artifact, but I, now cursed with the old man's story, saw a tomb, a stage, a haunted concert hall. I saw a 17-year-old girl, her eyes closed in rapture, her soul pouring into a final, perfect chord. "Do you believe it?" I finally asked him. "Do you believe she's still in there?" The old man looked at the dome, a strange, soft expression on his face. It was a look of profound sadness, but also of something else, a kind of reverence. "I am Kenji," he said simply. My blood ran cold. I stared at him, at the face like a dried riverbed, and saw the ghost of the young man who had sat on the rubble and heard the first impossible notes. "Belief is a complicated thing for a man my age," he continued, his gaze distant. "What I know is this. A city was destroyed. A brilliant young girl with a fire in her soul was stolen from the world. All that is left of her is a story, a melody. Maybe a ghost is just a story that refuses to die. Maybe her music was so strong, so full of life, that not even a bomb that could melt stone could truly silence it." He turned to leave, giving me a slight, courteous bow. "Listen carefully on your way back to your hotel tonight," he said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "Hiroshima is a very quiet city after midnight." That evening I did listen. As I walked across the Ioi Bridge, the city lights shimmering on the dark surface of the river, I stopped and looked at the dome, now floodlit against the night sky, a beautiful, terrible specter. The usual city sounds, the distant traffic, the murmur of late-night revelers, seemed to fade away. And in the deep, profound quiet, I held my breath. I listened for the sound of a lone violin, for a broken, beautiful chaconne carried on the night air, for the melody that became the eternal, horrifying, and enduring soul of the ruin. And I am not sure to this day what it was that I heard. Story: Where the Shadow Waits. The Lost Boy of Yokogawa Station. You have to understand something about Japan's train stations. They aren't just points on a map. They're the country's circulatory system, the pulsing veins and arteries through which its lifeblood flows. Millions of souls pass through them every day, a tidal wave of humanity in a perpetual rush. They are monuments to efficiency, to modernity, to the relentless forward march of time. Above ground, at least. But beneath, the polished floors, the glowing digital timetables, and the cheerful jingles announcing a departing train, there is another world, a world of concrete and iron, of forgotten tunnels and sealed-off chambers, a world that remembers, a world that waits. My name is Kenji Tanaka. For 32 years, I was a senior maintenance engineer for the West Japan Railway Company. I'm retired now, and my hands, once steady enough to rewire a signal box in a downpour, now shake when I lift my teacup. It's not just the age, it's the memory. I've spent my career in the guts of the system, the places passengers never see. I've walked miles of service tunnels, navigated mazes of electrical conduits, and breathed in the unique subterranean air, a cocktail of ozone, damp earth, and hot metal. I thought I had seen it all. I was wrong. This story begins, as many strange things do, with something mundane: water. It was the summer of 2003, a particularly wet and oppressive one in Hiroshima. A persistent leak had been reported in the substructure of Yokogawa Station. Not a major issue, just a nuisance. A slow drip, drip, drip that was causing pooling near a critical electrical junction. For weeks, junior teams had tried to trace it from the usual access points, with no luck. The schematics were old, dating back to the post-war reconstruction, and they hinted at a labyrinth of older, decommissioned passages. Finally, my supervisor, a perpetually stressed man named Ito-san, dropped a heavy, rust-pitted key on my desk. "Tanaka-san," he said, avoiding my eyes. "The problem is deeper. We think the source is the old pump room, the one in the pre-war foundation." I stared at the key. It was old-fashioned, a skeleton key of black iron, nothing like the modern coded cards we used. I hadn't seen one like it in decades. The pre-war section? I thought that was all permanently sealed after the... Well, after. Hiroshima doesn't talk about it constantly, but the ghost of 1945 is always there. It's in the quiet parks, the design of the new buildings, the solemn gaze of the elderly. The city is a survivor, proud and bustling, but it wears its scars beneath the surface. Yokogawa Station had been a ruin, a twisted skeleton of steel and scorched concrete. It was rebuilt, of course, bigger and better. But you can't just erase what was there before. You build over it. You seal it away. Ito-san sighed, rubbing his temples. It was sealed, mostly. But there's one access door left, behind the number 3 boiler in the west utility corridor. The schematics show a pump down there, an old sump pump that was meant to keep the original foundation dry. It must have finally failed after 60 years. We need someone to go down, shut it off, and see if we can bypass it. You're the only one who knows these old systems well enough. He paused, finally meeting my gaze. His own was uneasy. Take the kid with you. Haru. Haru was a new hire, barely 21. A good boy, eager and sharp, but green. He saw our job as a puzzle of wires and pipes. He didn't yet understand that we were working within a living, breathing history. It's a 2-man job, for safety, Ito-san added, a little too quickly. Standard procedure. Something in his tone set my teeth on edge. It wasn't just about a broken pump. There was a story here, an unspoken warning. But I was a professional. A job was a job. Understood, Ito-san, I said, picking up the heavy key. It was cold, unnaturally so, as if it had absorbed the chill of the place it was meant to unlock. The next morning, Haru and I gathered our gear, heavy-duty flashlights, a toolbox, a portable pump, and a 2-way radio that I insisted on, much to Haru's amusement. It's just a basement, Tanaka-san, he'd said with a laugh. Not the Amazon. When you can't see your hand in front of your face, and the only way out is a locked door behind you, you'll thank me for it, I'd grunted back. The west utility corridor was already a place few people went. It was a grimy, humming artery of the station's life support, lined with massive insulated pipes sweating condensation, and thick bundles of cables that snaked along the ceiling like metallic pythons. At the very end of the corridor, behind a hulking, decommissioned boiler that sat like a silent iron god, was the door. It wasn't much to look at, just a solid steel plate, painted a drab, institutional gray, now flaking away to reveal a dark, rust-pocked surface beneath. There was no handle, only a keyhole and 4 massive bolts at the corners that had been welded shut decades ago. Someone, at some point, had taken a grinder and cut through the welds, a job that looked rough and hurried. So much for permanently sealed, Haru muttered, his flashlight beam dancing over the scarred metal. Looks like someone's been in here since the war, I said, though a cold knot was tightening in my stomach. The air around the door felt stagnant, dead. The ambient hum of the station seemed to fall away, leaving a heavy, listening silence. I fitted the iron key into the lock. It turned with a ghastly, grinding screech, the sound of metal that hadn't moved since my father was a young man. The mechanism clunked heavily within the door. With a shared heave, Haru and I pulled it open. The smell hit us first. It wasn't just the expected scent of damp and decay. This was something else. It was thick, cloying, and organic. It smelled of wet earth, of mildew, and something else. Something faintly metallic and sweet, like old blood. Underneath it all was another odor, acrid and sharp. The ghost of something burnt long, long ago. Haru coughed, pulling the collar of his shirt over his nose. God, what is that? Smells like a sewer died. I didn't answer. I clicked on my high-beam flashlight and aimed it into the darkness. The beam cut through the black, illuminating a set of steep concrete steps leading down. They were slick with a dark, slimy film, and the walls on either side were weeping a blackish moisture that glistened in the light. Well, I said, forcing a confidence I didn't feel. The pump won't fix itself. You first, Haru. Watch your step. I knew putting him in front was a small cruelty, but I wanted to watch his back, and I wanted my own against the relative safety of the open doorway. He nodded. His earlier bravado gone, replaced by a tense focus. He started down the steps, his boots making squelching sounds that echoed unnervingly in the confined space. I followed, pulling the heavy door almost shut behind us but leaving it cracked just enough. I never liked sealing myself in. The stairway descended about 30 feet before opening into a larger space. It was a tunnel, not a room, a long, barrel-vaulted corridor made of old, soot-stained brick. It was clearly part of the original station structure, a relic that had somehow survived the blast. Pipes, thick with rust and corrosion, lined the walls. Here and there, old wiring, its insulation long since crumbled to dust, hung down from the ceiling like dead vines. A flashlight beams were the only source of light, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, eager to swallow the beams whole. The air was thick, heavy, and cold, a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the summer heat we'd left behind. The schematics said the pump room is at the end of this tunnel, on the left, I said, my voice sounding flat and small. We began to walk, our footsteps echoing in a strange, delayed rhythm. Drip, drip, drip. The sound of water was louder here, coming from all around us. It was a disorienting symphony of decay. The floor was uneven, covered in a sludge of mud and God knows what else. We had gone about 50 yards when Haru stopped dead. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice tight. "Hear what?" "I hear 1,000 drips." "No, not that. It was like a footstep, behind us." I turned, sweeping my light back down the tunnel. The beam illuminated nothing but the slick, glistening walls and the long, distorted shadows we cast. At the far end, the sliver of light from the open door was a comforting beacon. "It's just an echo, kid," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. "This place is playing tricks on us. Let's keep moving." But I had heard it too. A soft, shuffling sound, distinct from the drips. The sound of a bare foot dragging through the mire. We continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The oppressive silence was now charged with a sense of presence. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague paranoia. It was a physical weight on my shoulders. I could feel eyes on my back, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. Haru was practically glued to my side, his own flashlight beam darting nervously from shadow to shadow. It was then that we saw the first object. My light caught something small and pale against the dark sludge on the floor. I stopped and crouched down for a closer look, waving Haru over. It was a shoe. Not a modern shoe. It was a child's geta, a traditional wooden sandal. The wood was waterlogged and dark, almost black, but the simple, carved shape was unmistakable. The cloth thong, however, was what made me freeze. It was a faded blue, patterned with small white cherry blossoms, the kind a little boy might have worn to a summer festival. But one side of it was charred black, the fabric stiff and brittle, as if it had been licked by an immense and terrible heat. It was a single sandal. Its partner was nowhere to be seen. "What the hell is that doing down here?" Haru breathed, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. 100 rational explanations tried to form in my mind. It washed in. It was left by a worker years ago. It was just trash. But none of them felt right. Not here. Not in this cold waiting place. The sandal felt like a clue, a piece of a story I didn't want to know. I stood up, wiping my soiled glove on my pants. "Leave it. We're here for the pump." My voice was a command, as much for myself as for him. We had a job to do. Focus on the job. The logical, mechanical task. We found the pump room, another 20 yards down. It was a small, brick-lined alcove, barely large enough for 2 men to stand in. And in the center, half submerged in a pool of foul, stagnant water, was the pump. It was an ancient, cast-iron monstrosity, a relic of a bygone industrial age. It was silent, its motor seized by decades of rust and neglect. The source of the leak was obvious. A large feed pipe connected to it had rusted through, gushing a steady stream of water into the basin. which was now overflowing and seeping into the station's foundation. "Okay," I said, wading into the knee-deep water. It was shockingly cold. "The plan is simple. We shut off the main valve on that feed pipe, then hook up our portable pump to drain this pit. Once it's empty, we can cap the pipe properly." Haru nodded, looking relieved to have a concrete task. He sloshed over to the wall where a large, wheel-shaped valve was located. He put his hands on it and heaved. It didn't budge. "It's frozen solid," he grunted, straining. "Use the big wrench," I instructed, opening our toolbox. "Get some leverage on it." As Haru worked, grunting and cursing at the stubborn valve, I set up our portable pump. The small gasoline engine sputtered to life with a roar that was shockingly loud in the confined space, then settled into a steady, chugging rhythm. It was a comforting, modern sound, a sound of control. It was while I was connecting the outtake hose that the sound began. At first, it was almost imperceptible, hidden beneath the chugging of the pump and the dripping water. A low, soft sound, a mournful, weeping sound. I stopped what I was doing, straining my ears. Haru was still fighting with the valve, his back to me. "Haru!" I yelled over the engine. "Shut the pump off for a second." He looked over, confused, but did as I asked. He hit the kill switch, and the engine died with a final cough. Silence crashed down on us again, but it wasn't empty anymore. There it was, clear as day, the sound of a child crying. It was a thin, heartbroken sound, full of a sorrow so profound it felt ancient. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing down the long tunnel towards us. Haru's face went white as a sheet. His eyes were wide with terror. "Tanaka-san, what is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my own heart hammering against my ribs. My flashlight beam trembled as I pointed it back down the tunnel from which we'd come. The beam cut into the oppressive dark but revealed nothing, just the endless, weeping brick. The crying grew louder, closer. It was punctuated by a soft, dragging, shuffling sound, the same sound we'd heard before, the sound of a bare foot in the mud. Shuff. Sob. Shuff. Sob. "We need to go," Haru said, his voice cracking. He backed away from the valve, splashing in the water. "Now. Tanaka-san, we need to leave now." "The valve, Haru. We have to close the valve." The professional in me was screaming, battling with the primal fear that was threatening to consume me. If we didn't stop the leak, it could cause a short, a fire. The safety of the station, of the people above, depended on this. "To hell with the valve!" he shrieked, his voice echoing hysterically. And then, the crying stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was more terrifying than the sound itself. The air grew impossibly cold. I could see my own breath fogging in the beam of my flashlight. The water around my legs felt like ice. From the darkness, down the tunnel, a new sound emerged. A voice. A small, whispery voice that seemed to scratch its way through the years. "Don't go? Where?" It was a boy's voice, faint, lost. My blood ran cold. Haru let out a choked sob and pressed himself against the back wall of the alcove, as if trying to merge with the bricks. The shuffling sound was closer now, just outside the alcove. A small shadow began to detach itself from the larger darkness of the tunnel. It was indistinct at first, a patch of blackness that was somehow blacker than the rest. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my feet rooted to the muddy floor. My flashlight was fixed on that spot, my hand shaking so badly the beam jittered and danced. The shadow resolved itself into a shape, the shape of a small boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. He was standing at the edge of the light, just where the darkness began to fray. He was translucent, like smoke or old film. I could see the rusted pipes on the wall through his small frame. He was wearing what looked like the remnants of a wartime school uniform. A simple shirt and shorts, all of it tattered and gray with age and soot. But his skin was a patchwork of terrible, shadowy burns, dark patterns that swirled across his face and arms like ink spilled on paper. His eyes were the worst part, They were two huge, dark pools of emptiness, of bottomless grief. They weren't looking at us. They were looking down. He took another shuffling step forward, into the full glare of my flashlight. One of his feet was bare, raw, and red. The other was shod in a single scorched geta. He lifted his head slowly, and his hollow eyes met mine. The sheer force of his sorrow hit me like a physical blow. It was an agony that had been fermenting in this darkness for nearly 60 years. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out at first. Then the whisper slithered through the cold air again, clearer this time, a plea that transcended time and language. Watashi no geta o mimasen deshita ka? Have you seen my other sandal? Haru screamed. It wasn't a shout. It was a high, thin animal shriek of pure terror. That sound broke the spell that held me. Adrenaline, pure and potent, flooded my system. The job, the pump, the station, none of it mattered anymore. Only survival. Run! I roared, grabbing Haru by the arm and yanking him out of the alcove. We scrambled, splashing through the icy water, falling over our own feet. We abandoned everything. The tools, the pump, the radio I had insisted on. We ran blindly down the tunnel, our flashlight beams bouncing crazily off the walls, creating a dizzying, nightmarish strobing effect. Behind us, I could hear the shuffling sound quicken, keeping pace with us. And the weeping started again, louder this time, filled with a terrible, lonely anger. It was the sound of a child who had been promised something and had been hideously betrayed. The tunnel seemed to have stretched, the small sliver of light from the door impossibly far away. The air was thick with the boy's grief, so heavy I could barely draw a breath. I felt a phantom touch on my back, cold as a grave, and I swear I heard the whisper right in my ear. Might. Look. We didn't look back. We just ran. We burst up the concrete steps, gasping, sobbing, our boots slipping on the slime. We tumbled out into the utility corridor, into the warm, humming air of the present. I slammed the heavy steel door with all my strength. The sound of it closing was a thunderclap of finality. The weeping on the other side was cut off instantly. I fumbled for the key, my hands shaking so violently I could barely fit it into the lock. I turned it. The grinding screech, now a sound of salvation. It was locked. He was locked in. Haru had collapsed against the opposite wall, hyperventilating, his face a mask of waxy, unbelievable terror. I leaned against the cold steel door, my heart feeling like it was going to explode out of my chest, and slid down to the floor. For a long time, we just sat there, in the humming corridor, two modern men, reduced to trembling animals, listening to the silence on the other side of the door. Haru quit the next day. He never came back to work. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he moved away from Hiroshima to a town far to the north. He couldn't stand the trains anymore. I had to file a report. I couldn't tell the truth, of course. Who would believe me? So I wrote that we encountered unexpected and severe structural instability, including falling debris and noxious gases, making the area unsafe for any further work. I recommended the passage be permanently sealed. I stressed the noxious gases part, knowing it was the kind of bureaucratic trigger word that would get immediate action with no questions asked. My report was accepted. Yuto-san read it, his face pale, and simply nodded. He never asked what really happened. He didn't have to. I think in his own way, he already knew. A week later, a specialized team came. Not a maintenance team, but contractors. They didn't just lock the door. They welded a thick steel plate over the entire frame, sealing it completely. Then, they built a new concrete block wall in front of it, leaving no trace that a door had ever been there. The West Utility Corridor now simply ends in a blank, gray wall. The official reason for the persistent leak was eventually logged as untraceable groundwater seepage, and a new, expensive drainage system was installed above ground. I worked for another 15 years after that day, but I was never the same. I never again went into the deep, old places alone. Sometimes, when I was working late at the station, during the quiet hours after the last train had departed, I would think I could hear something. A faint weeping sound, carried on the vibrations of the building itself. I know what I saw. I saw a scar, a ghost not of malice, but of immense unplumbed sorrow, a single lost soul, one of thousands, left behind in the dark.
He wasn't a monster. He was just a little boy trapped in the last, terrifying moment of his life, forever searching for something that would make him whole again, something that was vaporized in the same instant he was.
They say time heals all wounds. I don't believe that's true. Some wounds are too deep. They don't heal. You just learn to build over them. You pave them with concrete and steel, run your shining modern world over the top and pretend they aren't there. But they are. Down in the cold and the dark, in the forgotten places beneath the rush of our feet. They wait. They remember. And sometimes, when a door that was meant to stay locked is opened, they ask you a question. And it's a question you will carry with you for the rest of your life. The echo in the dark. The city of Tokyo doesn't sleep, it breathes. During the day, it's a great, heaving lung, inhaling and exhaling millions of souls through its concrete and steel arteries. But at night, its respiration changes. It becomes a slower, deeper, almost predatory breathing. The exhalations are plumes of steam from late-night ramen stalls, the scent of rain on hot asphalt, the murmur of 1,000 hushed conversations behind paper screens. The inhalations are the silent, empty spaces, the darkened alleyways, the shuttered storefronts, and the vast hollow veins of the subway system. It was in these veins that Akari Tanaka found herself, a lone blood cell adrift in the city's nocturnal circulatory system. At 21, Akari was a student of architecture at one of Tokyo's most prestigious universities. Her life was a meticulously constructed blueprint of ambition. Days were spent in lecture halls, absorbing the stark beauty of brutalism and the fluid grace of metabolic design. Nights were a war waged against time, fueled by lukewarm convenience store coffee and the incandescent glow of a laptop screen. Her project, a scale model of a cantilevered museum, was due in less than 48 hours, and it was a demanding, unforgiving master. Tonight, she had lost. The tiny, intricate support beams had refused to align. A slip of her X-Acto knife had sent a crucial piece of foam core skittering into the abyss under her desk. By the time she had surrendered, admitting defeat until sunrise, the city's pulse had slowed to a crawl. The last trains were departing, their final calls echoing like mournful sighs through the deserted urban canyons. She practically sprinted the 5 blocks to Shinjuku Station, her portfolio case banging against her leg. The usual torrent of humanity had dwindled to a scattered collection of stragglers. Salarymen with neckties undone, sleeping on their feet. Young couples clinging to the last moments of a date, and the lost, the lonely, the ones who seemed to belong to the night itself. Akari's usual train, the Chuo line, had hissed its doors shut just as she clattered down the final set of stairs. A curse, sharp and silent, formed on her lips. She checked the departure board, its digital characters flickering under the harsh fluorescent lights. The next, and final option, was a local train on the Takaya line. It was a less direct route, a meandering, almost forgotten track that serviced the older, sleepier suburbs on the city's western fringe. It was known for its long, dark tunnels and infrequent stops. Locals sometimes called it the ghost train for its sparse late-night schedule. "It'll have to do," she muttered, her breath misting in the cool, subterranean air. The weariness was a physical weight on her shoulders, a leaden blanket she couldn't shrug off. All she wanted was her bed, the soft futon in her small, one-room apartment that represented the only true sanctuary in her life. The platform for the Takaya line was different. It felt older, deeper. The tiles were worn smooth and a faint, damp smell of earth and ozone hung in the air. Only a handful of people waited with her, standing far apart, each an island of solitude. A salaryman in a rumpled suit stared blankly at his phone. A high school girl, her uniform immaculate despite the late hour, had her headphones on, nodding her head to a silent beat. An old woman sat stoically on the bench, a cloth bag clutched in her lap. When the train finally arrived, it didn't glide into the station so much as it rattled. It was an older model, its silver paint dulled and scratched. The doors opened with a pneumatic groan that sounded like a sigh of exhaustion. Akari stepped inside. The car was long, sterile, and eerily bright. The rows of velvety green seats were almost entirely empty. She chose a seat near the middle, placing her heavy portfolio on the vacant spot beside her. The salaryman stumbled into the car after her, collapsing into a seat near the door. The high school girl chose the opposite end of the car, immediately absorbed back into her phone. The old woman didn't board. The doors slid shut, sealing them inside. With a lurch and a metallic shriek, the train began to move, pulling away from the relative safety of the station and plunging into the blackness of the tunnel.
The rhythmic clack, 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 clack of the wheels on the track was a hypnotic, lulling sound. Akari leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the tunnel lights whip by in a strobe-like blur. Her eyelids felt heavy as stones. The day's exhaustion was a tide pulling her under. The first stop, Nakano, came and went. The salaryman, who had been snoring softly, jolted awake, realized it was his stop, and scrambled out just as the doors were closing. Now it was just Akari and the girl at the far end of the car. The second stop, Koenji. The girl gathered her things and departed, her footsteps echoing on the platform, before being swallowed by the train's departure. Now, Akari was alone. Or so she thought. It was the cold that alerted her, a subtle shift in the car's atmosphere, as if an unseen window had been cracked open, letting in the damp subterranean chill. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of her neck, the ancient, instinctual alarm that says, "You are being watched." Her eyes flickered open. She didn't move her head, instead letting her gaze drift to the polished black window. In its reflection, she could see the entire brightly lit car stretched out behind her like a photograph. And in the far corner, tucked into the very last seat, was a figure that hadn't been there before. It was a man. He was hunched over, his posture unnaturally still. He wore a drab, dark coat that seemed a size too big, its collar turned up. But it was his face, or lack thereof, that made the blood in her veins turn to ice. He was wearing a plain, white surgical mask, the kind seen everywhere in Tokyo. Yet on him, it wasn't for hygiene. It was for concealment. It was a blank, featureless void where a person should be. Above the mask, his eyes were cast down, hidden by the shadow of his messy, unkempt hair. Akari's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He must have gotten on at Koenji, she reasoned, her mind scrambling for logic, for a rational explanation. I was half asleep. I didn't see him. He's just another tired commuter. But he wasn't behaving like a commuter. He was rocking. A slow, almost imperceptible, back and forth motion. A metronome, counting down to something terrible. And as she continued to watch his reflection, she thought she could see his lips moving, behind the thin white fabric of the mask. He was muttering. She strained to hear over the train's clatter, but the words were a low, guttural drone, lost in the ambient noise. It sounded less like language and more like an incantation, a dry, rasping prayer to some forgotten god of filth and darkness. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. She sat bolt upright, her pretense of sleep gone. She kept her eyes fixed on the window, using it as a mirror, not daring to turn and look at him directly. To make eye contact, she felt, would be to acknowledge him, to invite him into her reality. Just a weirdo, she told herself, her mantra a flimsy shield against a growing dread. Every city has them. He'll get off at the next stop. Just ignore him. The train slowed for the next station, Asagaya. The brakes screeched. The doors groaned open. Akari held her breath, her knuckles white where she gripped her portfolio case. She prayed. To any god that might be listening in this fluorescent purgatory, for him to get up and leave.
He didn't move. The rocking continued. The muttering didn't stop. The doors hissed shut. The train lurched forward. They were alone again. And the character of the journey changed. The familiar clack-clack of the wheels seemed to take on the rhythm of his muttering. The fluorescent lights overhead began to flicker, each brief moment of darkness a terrifying punctuation mark. In those flickers, his reflection in the window seemed to jerk and twitch, his form momentarily indistinct, like a poorly tuned television signal.
Akari's mind raced. She could get up and move to another car at the next stop. Yes, that was the plan. It was a simple, logical solution. She would walk briskly, without looking back, and put a physical barrier between them. But her body refused to cooperate. Her limbs felt heavy, filled with cement. A primal fear had taken root in her spine, telling her that to move was to draw his attention. To stand was to make herself a target. All she could do was sit, frozen, a stone statue of terror, watching his ghostly reflection in the glass. He lifted his head. It was a slow, deliberate movement. In the reflection, she saw his face tilt upwards. He was no longer looking at the floor. He was looking directly at her reflection, at her eyes in the glass. Even with the distance and the distortion of the window, she could feel the intensity of his stare. It was not a curious gaze. It was a hungry one. An ancient, predatory stillness. A sound escaped her throat, a tiny, strangled gasp. The train, as if on cue, let out a long, mournful whistle. It was the signal that they were approaching the longest tunnel on the Takaya line, a notorious 5-kilometer stretch of absolute unbroken blackness between Nishio-Dikubo and Kichijoji. The entrance to the tunnel loomed, a perfect black rectangle. The train didn't just enter it, it was devoured by it. One moment there was the strobing blur of suburban lights, the next, absolute nothing. The emergency lights inside the car flickered on, casting a dim, sickly red glow. But then, with a low hum, they died too. A power fluctuation, perhaps, or something else. They were plunged into a darkness so complete, so profound, it felt like a physical substance. It pressed in on Akari from all sides, silencing the world. The only sound was the relentless clack-clack, clack-clack of the wheels, a sound that now seemed impossibly loud, a drumbeat in the void. Her senses were on fire. She couldn't see, so she listened. She listened for the rustle of his coat, for the sound of a footstep, for the low, continuous muttering. There was only silence. The man had gone quiet. This was somehow worse. The muttering had been unnerving, but at least it was a sign of his location. The silence was a gaping question mark. Where was he? What was he doing? The darkness felt infinite. Seconds stretched into minutes. Akari held her breath until her lungs burned. Her imagination, a far more cruel torturer than any man, began to paint pictures in the blackness. She saw him crawling along the floor like an insect. She saw him standing right beside her, his masked face inches from hers. She saw his hand reaching out, his fingers long and spider-like. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if that could make the darkness any darker, any less terrifying. Don't think, just wait for the light. The light will come back. And then, it did. With a final, jarring clatter, the train burst from the tunnel. The bright, reassuring lights of the car flickered back to life, flooding the space with a brilliant, sterile white. Akari blinked, her pupils contracting painfully. Her first, instinctual action was to whip her head around and look at the corner where the man had been sitting. It was empty. The seat was vacant. The space was void. He was gone. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made her sick washed over her. It was a physical sensation, a loosening of every coiled muscle in her body. She let out a shaky, hysterical laugh. He must have gotten off in the dark. No, that was impossible. The doors hadn't opened. He must have moved to another car, silently, under the cover of the absolute blackness. That had to be it. He was just a creep, playing a sick game, and he was gone. She leaned her head back against the seat, her heart still pounding a wild rhythm against her ribs. But now it was a rhythm of survival, not of terror. She closed her eyes for a moment,
letting the sheer, unadulterated relief wash over her. It was over. She had never been more wrong. The sense came first. Not a sound, not a sight, but a feeling. The feeling of displaced air. The subtle warmth of another body, impossibly close. The faint, foul scent of dust and something vaguely metallic, like old blood. A cold dread, far worse than anything she had felt before, began to snake its way up from the pit of her stomach. It was the chilling, absolute certainty that she was no longer alone in her immediate vicinity. The space directly behind her was no longer empty. Slowly, as if moving through water, she turned her head. Her gaze traveled past the empty green seat beside her, past the aisle, and to the space right behind her own seat. He was there. He hadn't moved to another car. He hadn't vanished. In the 5 minutes of perfect, silent darkness, he had traversed the length of the train car without making a single sound. He was now standing in the aisle, directly behind her, hunched over so that his masked face was level with hers. Time seemed to stop. The clack-clack of the train faded into a distant hum. The world narrowed to the two of them. His eyes, no longer hidden by shadow, were visible above the mask. They were not angry. They were not mad. They were flat, black, and utterly devoid of anything human. They were like the eyes of a shark, ancient and empty and merciless. He leaned closer. The fabric of his coat brushed against the back of her seat. The smell of decay and damp earth intensified. She could feel the faint, whisper-soft vibration of his body. His head tilted, a bird-like gesture of curiosity. And then he spoke. His voice was not a mutter now. It was a whisper, a dry, sibilant hiss that seemed to scrape against the inside of her ear. It was a voice that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. And the words he whispered were not a threat, not an insult, not anything she could have ever prepared for. They were a question that fractured reality itself.
"Excuse me," he hissed, his breath cold and foul against her skin. "Can you help me? I seem to be lost." Akari was frozen, a fly in amber. She couldn't scream. She couldn't move. She could only listen as the voice of the abyss whispered its impossible question. "Where is the Takaya line?" The words hung in the air, a paradox wrapped in a nightmare. They were on the Takaya line. The sign above the door said Takaya line. The automated announcement, even now, was announcing the next stop on the Takaya line. The question made no sense. It was the question of a man not from this place, not from this time, not from this reality. He was a glitch in the world, a specter who had boarded the wrong train and was now looking for a way home. And he thought she had the answer. His empty eyes bored into hers. The whisper came again, more insistent this time, laced with a terrifying, inhuman frustration. "Where is it? Tell me." That broke the spell. The sheer, existential wrongness of it all snapped the chains of her paralysis. A primal scream, a sound of pure animal terror, ripped itself from her throat. She didn't think. She reacted. She lunged forward, scrambling over her own portfolio, stumbling into the aisle. She ran. She didn't look back. She couldn't. To look back would be to see him unfold from his crouch, to see him pursue her. She could feel his presence behind her like a cold shadow, a silent, relentless pursuit. Her only thought was the door to the next car. Her fumbling hands found the handle, a heavy, cold metal lever. She yanked it with all her strength. It resisted, then gave way with a heavy clunk. She threw her shoulder against the door, bursting through into the connecting gangway. The space between cars was a roaring, chaotic hell. The wind screamed past her, whipping her hair across her face, trying to steal the breath from her lungs. The train swayed violently, and the metal plates under her feet shifted and groaned. Below, the tracks were a dizzying, hypnotic blur. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled across the shuddering plates, her hands grabbing at the cold, greasy accordion walls for balance. She reached the door to the next car and wrenched it open, tumbling inside. She slammed it shut behind her, leaning against it, her chest heaving, her lungs burning. She fumbled with the lock, her trembling fingers finding the heavy bolt and ramming it home. The car was empty.
utterly, completely empty. A sterile, silent, fluorescent tube. She was safe. She had put a locked door between herself and the thing. She slid down the door to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. She was sobbing now, great, shuddering, silent sobs of terror and relief. She stayed there, huddled on the floor, for what felt like an eternity. The train slowed, its brakes squealing. The familiar, feminine voice of the automated system announced the arrival at Kichijoji Station. The doors hissed open. The sudden influx of sound and normalcy from the platform, the chatter of people, the distant sound of music, was the most beautiful thing Akari had ever heard. She forced her trembling legs to obey her, stumbling out of the train and onto the solid, unmoving platform. She didn't look back at the car she had fled. She couldn't bear to look. She just kept moving, pushing through the small crowd, her eyes wide with a terror no one else could see. She burst out of the station and into the cool night air of the city. She didn't stop running until she reached the door of her own apartment building, 3 kilometers away. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to get the key in the lock. Inside, she slammed the door, bolted it, and chained it. She leaned against it, her body finally succumbing to the violent trembling she had been holding back. She was safe. She was home. But the horror was not over. The man on the train hadn't needed to touch her. He hadn't needed to physically harm her. He had planted a seed of terror that would grow and fester in the quiet moments. Sleep, when it finally came, was not a refuge. It was a continuation. She dreamt of endless train cars, of flickering lights and a suffocating absolute darkness. She dreamt of a dry, sibilant whisper asking a question she could never answer. She would wake up gasping, her sheets soaked in cold sweat, the foul scent of dust and decay still lingering in her nostrils. The city, once her playground of ambition, became a landscape of fear. Every man in a surgical mask was him. Every crowded subway car was a potential trap. The rhythmic clatter of a train was no longer a lulling sound. It was the prelude to a nightmare. She began taking the bus, even though it added an hour to her commute. She never finished the museum model. Her meticulously constructed life began to crumble. Her grades slipped. She stopped going out with friends. She would spend hours staring out her window at the city below, feeling like a prisoner. The man on the train had taken something from her that night. Not her life, but her sense of safety, her trust in the rational world. He had shown her that there were cracks in reality, and that terrible, incomprehensible things could slip through. Weeks turned into months. The raw terror faded into a dull, constant thrum of anxiety. Akari began to believe she might one day be normal again. She started to think of it as a hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by stress and exhaustion. It was the only explanation that allowed her to function. One rainy Tuesday evening, she was heading home late again. She stood on the bus, holding the overhead strap, staring at her own reflection in the rain-streaked window. The bus was warm and crowded, a bubble of mundane reality. She watched her own tired face in the glass. And then, for a single, heart-stopping second, it changed. In the reflection, her own mouth and nose were suddenly covered by a stark, white surgical mask. Her own eyes staring back at her were flat, black, and utterly empty. She gasped and recoiled, stumbling backward into another passenger. She looked again. It was just her own face, pale and terrified. A trick of the light, a phantom of her traumatized mind. But she knew in that chilling moment that the man on the train had never truly left her. He was no longer in the corner of the car. He was in the corner of her mind. He hadn't needed to find the Takaya line. He had found something better. He had found a new place to haunt. He had found her. And she knew, with a certainty that was colder and deeper than any fear she had felt that night, that she would be riding that ghost train with him, alone in the dark, for the rest of her life. Story: The Seventh Room. There are certain truths a physicist must accept. The conservation of energy is one. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transferred or changed from one form to another. I built my life on this principle, on the elegant, predictable dance of particles and waves. I, An Qua Tran, a boy from the bustling, sun-drenched streets of Saigon, had earned my place at Hiroshima University to chase these truths. I was a man of science, a believer in the observable, the quantifiable. I did not believe in ghosts. But energy, as I would learn, can curdle. It can stagnate and fester in a place, twisting into something unrecognizable, something that remembers. And in the fall of 2008, in a small, sterile room on the second floor of the Kagamiyama International House, I learned that some forms of energy have a chilling, terrible permanence. They have a name, they have a story, and they do not wish to be alone. The room was number 7. My arrival in Hiroshima was a blur of controlled excitement. Japan was everything I had dreamed of, a land of profound order and subtle beauty, a stark contrast to the chaotic vibrancy of home. The university campus was a modern marvel, rising from the ashes of a history so devastating it felt like a scar on the world itself. But this was a new Hiroshima, a city of peace and forward-thinking ambition. I was here to be a part of that future. The Kagamiyama dormitory was a concrete monolith, functional and unadorned. Mr. Takeda, the dorm manager, was a man carved from the same material. He was short, wiry, with a face that seemed permanently fixed in a state of weary resignation. He grunted more than he spoke, his movements economical as he processed my paperwork. Tran, An Qua, he mumbled, his finger tracing a line in a ledger. He paused. A flicker of something, hesitation, annoyance crossed his features. Room 207.
He handed me a key attached to a simple wooden fob, the number 7 etched into its surface. He didn't say second floor, he just said 7, as if the floor number was an irrelevant prefix to the room's true identity. You have a roommate, he added, not looking at me. He arrives next week, from Korea. Thank you, Takeda-san, I said, bowing slightly. He merely grunted again, his eyes already on the next task. But as I turned to leave, he said something in a low voice, almost a whisper. The room is clean. We cleaned it. It was a bizarrely specific thing to say. Of course it was clean. This was Japan. But the way he said it, with a finality that brooked no argument, planted a tiny cold seed in my mind. The hallway to my room was long and antiseptic, smelling of floor polish and the faint lingering scent of instant ramen. I passed rooms 1, 2, 3. The doors were identical, impersonal. When I reached room 7, I stopped. There was nothing different about it. Same brown door, same brass number plate. Yet, the air around it felt different, heavier, colder. I shook my head, dismissing it as the jitters of a new place in a new country. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was a perfect mirror image. 2 beds, 2 desks, 2 closets, 2 windows. A small shared kitchenette and bathroom were tucked into an alcove. It was Spartan, but immaculate. My side was on the left. The other side, my future roommate's, was pristine. The mattress bare, the desk empty. The air inside was still and cold, far colder than the hallway. It held a strange silence, a compressed quiet that felt like the moment after a loud noise has abruptly stopped. I dropped my heavy suitcases, the sound echoing unnaturally in the small space. I chose the left side, closer to the door. It felt safer. I spent the rest of the day unpacking, arranging my physics textbooks on the shelf, hanging my few clothes in the closet. I tried to inject my own life, my own energy, into the sterile space. But the room seemed to resist. It felt like trying to light a match in a vacuum. No matter what I did, the oppressive stillness and the inexplicable chill remained. That first night, I learned the room had its own rhythm. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by the unfamiliar sounds of the building. But there were other sounds too. Sounds that didn't belong. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a faint noise. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was the sound of a pen on paper, slow, deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the other side of the room, from the empty desk. My heart hammered against my ribs. I lay perfectly still, my ears straining in the darkness. The sound continued for a few minutes, the steady, rhythmic scratching of someone writing or perhaps drawing. Then it stopped. It was followed by the softest sigh, a breath of profound sadness that seemed to hang in the air right next to me before dissipating. I told myself it was the pipes,
I told myself it was the heating system. I told myself I was tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. I was a man of science. There was a rational explanation for everything. I was wrong. The first week was a masterclass in self-deception. I threw myself into my studies, spending long hours in the university library. I made a few friends, including a friendly senior student named Kenji, who lived on the floor above. He was a business major, with a boisterous laugh and a kind heart. "So, you're in the famous room 7, he said one afternoon as we ate lunch in the crowded cafeteria. My blood ran cold. Famous? What do you mean? Kenji's smile faltered. He looked around nervously. Just stories. Every old dorm has them. He tried to laugh it off, but his eyes told a different story. What stories, Kenji? I pressed, my voice low. He sighed, pushing his katsudon around his plate. Okay, look, just don't freak out. They say it's haunted. A few years ago, a girl, she was in your program, actually, physics, very smart, but very intense. The pressure got to her. She killed herself in that room. The cafeteria noise faded into a dull roar. The air in my lungs felt thick and heavy. In room 7, he confirmed, his voice barely a whisper. They say she never left. People who've lived there. They see things, hear things. The last guy who had it, a student from Taiwan. He lasted 3 weeks, left in the middle of the night, didn't even pack all his stuff. I tried to construct a scientific rebuttal in my head. Mass hysteria, suggestibility, auditory pareidolia. The words were a flimsy shield against the primal fear that was now coiling in my gut. It's just superstition, Kenji, I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. I hope so, Kwa-kun, he said, his face serious. I really do, but be careful. That night, the politeness began, and the politeness was the most terrifying thing of all. I was studying late at my desk, wrestling with a complex problem in quantum mechanics. My books and papers were spread out in a chaotic mess. Exhausted, I gave up around 1 a.m. and collapsed into bed. The next morning, I woke up to find my desk perfectly tidy. My textbooks were stacked in a neat pile. My scattered papers were squared away, and my pen was placed precisely parallel to the stack. My first thought was that my Korean roommate had arrived early and was exceptionally neat. I checked the other side of the room. It was still empty, untouched. The door had been locked from the inside. No one had been in the room but me. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't a hostile act. It wasn't a violent poltergeist throwing things. This was helpful, orderly. It was the act of a diligent student. The ghost of a diligent student. The girl from my program. The phenomena began to escalate, weaving themselves into the fabric of my daily existence. They were subtle, almost mundane, which made them infinitely more disturbing. If I left my closet door ajar, I would return to find it shut. If I left a wet towel on the bed, I'd find it hanging neatly on the hook behind the bathroom door. And then there was the studying. Every night, like clockwork, between 1 and 3 a.m., the activity would start. The soft scratching of the pen, the rustle of a turning page, even though all my books were closed. Sometimes I would hear the faint squeak of the other desk chair, as if someone had shifted their weight. I took to sleeping with headphones on, blasting music to drown it out, but I could still feel it. The presence was a weight, a pressure drop in the room's atmosphere. It was the feeling of not being alone, magnified 1,000 times. I started talking to it. Not out loud at first, just in my head. Please, leave me alone. This is my room now. The only answer was the chilling, methodical silence of its nightly routine. The nights were the worst. I'd lie in bed, rigid with fear, my eyes screwed shut. On several occasions, I felt a gentle, almost imperceptible tug on my blanket, as if someone were trying to pull it up to my chin to keep me warm. The gesture was so motherly, so caring, that it filled me with a terror more profound than any scream. This entity wasn't trying to scare me, it was trying to live with me. And its idea of cohabitation was a waking nightmare. One night, the cold in the room became unbearable. It was a damp, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. I got up to check the window, ensuring it was latched. It was. As I turned back, my breath caught in my throat. In the faint moonlight filtering through the blinds, I saw it. An indentation on the other bed. It was the perfect, shallow depression of a human form, lying on its side, facing my bed. It was as if an invisible person were lying there, watching me. I stared, my heart a frantic drum in the cavern of my chest, unable to move, unable to breathe. I watched for what felt like an eternity as the indentation slowly, gradually faded away, the mattress returning to its flat, pristine state. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat at my desk, the lamp on, my back pressed against the wall, watching the empty bed until the sun came up. My life began to unravel. Sleep deprivation made me a ghost in my own right. I walked through my days in a fog. My grades, once my pride, began to plummet. I couldn't focus in class. My mind would constantly drift back to the room, to the nightly rituals, to the feeling of being perpetually watched. I lost weight. Dark circles formed under my eyes, twin bruises of exhaustion and fear.
Kenji grew worried. Kua, you look terrible. What's going on? Is it the room? I finally broke. In a quiet corner of the campus, I told him everything. The tidy desk, the blanket, the pen, the indentation on the bed. I spoke in a frantic, hushed tone, terrified someone would overhear and think I was insane. Kenji listened, his usual boisterous demeanor gone, replaced by a deep, somber concern. I believe you, he said, his voice firm. I told you, the guy before you, he said similar things. He said he felt her trying to help him study. He said she would turn the pages of his textbook when he fell asleep at his desk. What do I do, Kenji? My voice was a raw plea. I can't live like this. You have to talk to Takeda-san, he urged. Demand a new room. That afternoon, I confronted the dorm manager. I found him in his small, cluttered office, hunched over the same ledger as before. Takeda-san, I began, my voice trembling slightly. I need to change rooms. He didn't look up. No rooms available. Dormitory is full. It's about room 7, I said, my voice gaining an edge of desperation. There is something wrong with it. I can't sleep. I can't study. Finally, he lifted his head. His eyes were dark and tired, but for the first time, I saw a flicker of something else in them. Pity. Many students find the first year difficult, Transon. It is a lot of pressure. This isn't pressure. I almost shouted, my carefully maintained composure shattering. There is someone in my room, a ghost, the girl who died there. The word ghost hung in the air between us. Takeda-san's face hardened. He stood up, a small man who suddenly seemed to command all the authority in the world. There is nothing in that room, he said, his voice low and dangerous. It was a tragedy, a sad, private tragedy. The room has been blessed by a Shinto priest. It has been cleaned. There is nothing there. You are tired. You are stressed. Go back to your room and get some sleep. His denial was so absolute, so forceful. It was like running into a brick wall. I saw then that he would not help me. He was a guardian of the dormitory's reputation, not its students. Admitting the room was haunted would be an institutional failure. It was easier to believe I was losing my mind. As I left his office, defeated, the horrifying thought struck me. Maybe I was. Maybe the stress, the isolation, had finally fractured my rational mind. I was a physicist, and I was seeing ghosts. The contradiction was tearing me apart. That night, I decided to fight back with the only weapon I had: science. I borrowed a sensitive digital audio recorder from the physics lab. My plan was simple. I would leave it recording all night. I would capture the sounds, the scratching, the sighing, and prove to myself and to others that they were real. It was an experiment, an observation. I would collect data. I set the recorder on my nightstand, hit the record button, and crawled into bed. For the first time in weeks, I had a mission. It gave me a sliver of courage. I addressed the empty room in a firm, clear voice. My name is Ann Qua Tran. I live here now. I mean you no harm, but you are disturbing me. I need you to leave me in peace. Please. The silence that answered was deeper, colder than ever before.
I felt a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The air grew thick, heavy with a resentful energy. The politeness was gone. I had made a terrible mistake. I didn't hear the pen that night. I didn't hear the turning pages. I heard nothing. The silence was absolute, a vacuum of sound that was more terrifying than any noise. I fell into an uneasy, dream-filled sleep. In my dream, I was drowning in black, icy water. A girl with long, dark hair wrapped around me, pulling me down, her mouth open in a silent scream.
I woke up with a gasp, my body drenched in cold sweat. Sunlight was streaming into the room. It was morning. My heart was still pounding from the nightmare. I reached for the audio recorder, my hands shaking. This was it, the proof. I rewound the recording to the middle of the night and pressed play. For the first few hours, there was only the sound of my own restless turning and the low hum of the building. I fast-forwarded, listening intently. Nothing. Just silence. My heart sank. Was it all in my head? Then I heard it. It started around 3:15 a.m. It wasn't the sound of a pen, it was a voice. A girl's voice, whispering in Japanese. It was so faint, I had to press the recorder to my ear and turn the volume all the way up. Samishi. Lonely. Kuroshi. Painful. In agony. The whispers grew more frantic, layered on top of each other. It was a chorus of despair. And then, a new sound emerged from underneath the whispers. The sound of crying, a gut-wrenching, heartbroken sobbing that seemed to fill my head. My blood turned to ice. But the worst was yet to come. The sobbing stopped abruptly. And then, the voice spoke again. It was no longer whispering. It was clear. It was right next to the microphone. It was right next to my bed. It said my name. Koa-san. And then, in halting, accented Vietnamese, a language it had no business knowing, it whispered a single, horrifying phrase. Đi về toi. Go with me. I threw the recorder across the room. It smashed against the far wall, the batteries skittering across the floor. I scrambled out of bed, my mind reeling. It knew my name. It had learned my language. It wasn't just an echo of the past anymore. It was aware. It was learning. It was focused on me. The final night was a descent into pure, undiluted horror. I knew I couldn't stay another minute, but it was late, and a typhoon was raging outside, lashing Hiroshima with torrential rain and howling winds. The entire dorm building groaned and shuddered. I was trapped. I huddled at my desk, every light in the room blazing. I tried to read my physics book, to anchor myself in the solid, predictable world of logic, but the words were just meaningless symbols on the page. The storm outside was a symphony for what was about to happen inside. Around midnight, the power flickered and died. I was plunged into absolute darkness, a blackness so complete it felt like a physical substance. The only light was the occasional terrifying flash of lightning that illuminated the room in stark, epileptic snapshots. The only sound was the roar of the wind and the pounding of my own heart. I fumbled for my phone, my hands slick with sweat. I turned on its flashlight, the weak beam cutting a pathetic cone through the oppressive dark. I aimed it at the door, planning my escape. I would run out into the storm, I didn't care. Anywhere but here. That's when I heard the giggle. It was a little girl's giggle, high-pitched and utterly devoid of mirth. It came from the other side of the room. My light beam snapped towards the sound, shaking violently. The empty bed, the empty desk. Nothing. "Who's there?" I whimpered, the words catching in my throat. The giggle came again, this time from right behind me. I spun around, crying out, my flashlight beam wildly slashing across the walls. Nothing. I was alone. But I wasn't. The cold in the room was now a physical presence, a glacial weight pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and I saw her. She was standing in the corner by the window. For a split second, she was as solid as I was. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, in a simple white dress. Her long black hair was soaking wet, plastered to her pale face and thin frame. Her eyes were wide, black pools of infinite despair. Her feet were not touching the floor. The room was plunged back into darkness. I screamed. It was a raw, animal sound of pure terror. I scrambled backwards, tripping over my chair and crashing to the floor.
My phone flew from my hand, its light extinguishing as it hit the ground. I was in the dark, with her. I could hear her moving, a soft, wet, shuffling sound, the sound of wet feet on a linoleum floor. She was coming for me. "Kurushi," she whispered, her voice now seeming to come from everywhere at once. "The pain is unbearable. Ishoni, let's be together." I felt a frigid touch on my ankle. It was colder than ice, a dead cold that seemed to suck the very heat from my bones. It was a small, delicate hand, but its grip was like iron. It began to pull me. I kicked and thrashed, sobbing, trying to crawl away. But the grip was unbreakable. I was being dragged across the floor, towards the center of the room. The smell of stagnant pond water and decay filled my nostrils. Another flash of lightning. Her face was directly above mine. Her eyes were black holes, her mouth a rictus of agony. Water, or maybe tears, streamed down her face, dripping onto mine. They were ice cold. "Divoitoi," she shrieked. Her voice, a hurricane of sound that was both in my ears and inside my head. It was no longer a whisper. It was a command. In that moment of ultimate terror, something inside me broke. All the science, all the logic, all the rational thought evaporated, leaving only one primal instinct: survival. "No!" I roared, fueled by sheer adrenaline. "Your name! What is your name?" The grip faltered. The shrieking stopped. The pressure in the room lessened for a microsecond. I didn't know why I asked it. The question just burst out of me. Maybe it was some half-remembered folklore, the idea that naming a thing gives you power over it. A new voice entered my mind. It wasn't hers. It was a memory, a fragment of my conversation with Kenji. They say her name was Yuki. Happiness. Ironic, isn't it? "Yuki!" I screamed into the darkness. "Your name is Yuki. You are not happy. You are in pain. But your pain is not my pain. Your death is not my death. Leave me be." The room erupted. It was as if a bomb of psychic energy detonated. A force, immense and violent, threw me backwards. My head slammed against the leg of my desk with a sickening crack. The frigid hand was gone. The whispering, the shrieking, the cold, it all vanished, sucked out of the room as if a door to a vacuum had been opened and then slammed shut. The silence that returned was empty, truly empty. For the first time since I had arrived, the room felt completely, blessedly alone. Then, the lights flickered back on. I lay on the floor, gasping, my body trembling uncontrollably. The room was a wreck. My chair was overturned, my books were scattered, my phone lay smashed near the door. But it was over. I knew it in my soul. She was gone. Epilogue. I never spent another night in Kagamiyama International House. I crashed on Kenji's floor until I found a small apartment in the city. I never told Mr. Takeda what happened. What was the point? He wouldn't have believed me. I did hear, through the student grapevine, that my Korean roommate arrived the next week. He lasted exactly 4 days. I finished my degree at Hiroshima. I became a physicist. I now work at a research facility in California, surrounded by the beautiful, predictable laws of the universe. I have a wife and a daughter. My life is full of light and logic. But some nights, when the house is quiet and I'm working late, I feel it. A sudden, inexplicable chill in the air. The faint feeling of being watched. I'll see a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, and my heart will seize in my chest. I have to stop, take a deep breath, and ground myself in the here and now, in the provable world I have so carefully constructed around me. I know that energy is never truly destroyed. It only changes form. I believe that a great and terrible energy was unleashed in that room. The energy of pain, of loneliness, of despair. And I believe that by screaming her name, I did not destroy it. I only transferred it. I gave it a direction, a way out. And now a small, cold piece of it lives inside of me, a permanent echo of the girl in the seventh room. A quiet reminder that there are some equations that have no solution, some forces that cannot be measured, and some rooms that should forever remain empty.